have a session now on the Sisyphus reviews. We've got a number of speakers for these Sisyphus reviews, and these came out of a workshop that we ran, which was to identify knowledge gaps and to provide key data for the database that we're going to be putting together for Reclaim Network, the GBGI database. The 7 reviews that we identified were water flow and quality mitigation, air pollution, urban cooling, noise mitigation, biodiversity, carbon stocks and sequestration, and also health and wellbeing. So without listening to me much more, what I'd like to do is pass over to Prashant to give you the first review.
Okay, so as our chair said, we had 7 reviews. So this is first of the 7, which was focused on looking into the benefits of the green and blue infrastructure for urban cooling. So this is basically one of the reviews which is almost complete. So this kind of sets up the scene for the other reviews which are still in progress. And there was a large team of collaborators across almost 15 countries that came together actually to put this review. Currently, this is under review with the journal. We're just hoping that it just gets through. So the whole idea here was to understand, first of all, that what kind of, the GBGI, which is the green and blue and grey infrastructure used in the urban space, and how do they vary in terms of their effectiveness. So we have seen the trees and the hedges and everything, but you'll be amazed to see that if you put a number on them, that how many will they be. So we ended up having a list of 51 GBGI types, and that we kind of group them into the 10 different categories, and then try to look into systematically that what kind of the impact they make. So the whole idea is to look into the performance, but also identify the knowledge gaps so that the community or some of us actually could take forward as part of the future research projects. So the reviews, they included mostly focused around the green and blue infrastructure and the urban heat mitigation. And it did not really talk about the health or the other kind of the co-benefits in this particular case. So I think it's difficult to read, but these are the 51 different type of GBGIs which we kind of selected for that. And then there were these 10 different categories which you can see on the extreme left, the garden, parks, and all. Within those, actually, you can have the different ones as well. So these basically shows the number of publications. So it's a structural review to understand actually what's in the literature and what is available. So when we started with almost around 28,000, the papers which were identified, and then we started kind of screening, and then we ended up around 202 papers which were kind of discussed. Interestingly, you could see that there was very little in the earlier years. And then you could see quite a big jump actually from 27 onwards. And obviously in 2022, that was the biggest jump. That might be an impact of COVID actually, where people were more focused about the green space and seeing the value and benefit of it. And then we looked into the how this is spread. So this was quite an interesting finding in the sense that you see a quite widespread, but the Asia, you look at around half of these studies were done there. But there were loads of them actually. In fact, 3/4 of them comes alone from China. So there is a lot of work in that, which is basically biasing actually those numbers. Obviously, the Europe is on the forefront, and then there are other continents where there is a bit of work actually in bits and pieces. And if you look into the what kind of areas are well presented, so this is really interesting one, in the sense that you see a lot of work around the constructed GIs, which like the green walls, the roofs and so on. And you see very little actually on some of the areas, like the amenity areas, mixed and the other public spaces, like you heard earlier, like on the gardens, for example, there is very little actually information there. So this is where And we look into the, the proportion of the studies, so a lot of them just focusing around the constructed GI. While if you look at the urban space, I think all of them are important in one way or another. So when we look into the efficacy and the gaps, actually, you can see the gray is showing that where there is literally nothing, and the green is basically showing that where there is the most of the studies were found in there. And the efficacy could vary depending on the one you are using, varying from almost 2 degrees to 7.5 degrees centigrade during the kind of in the heat wave sort of situation there. So I think there is the recommendations we put forward in the end, and those recommendations, we kind of draw actually the 10 recommendations based on the evidence base we had and proposed a kind of a framework there. So I'm not going to go into the detail in there, but hopefully this will be out and we'll be able to share through our newsletters. Yeah, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prashant. As before, we only have these 5-minute sessions, and then hopefully you can discuss with everyone during the breaks. So I think the next one is David Fletcher's. That's recorded.
Hello, my name's David Fletcher. I work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and I've been conducting the Noise Pollution Mitigation Synthesis Review. As the name suggests, this is looking at noise mitigation provided by urban green, blue, grey infrastructure, GBGI, looking predominantly at traffic noise, but also general noise in some situations. And the GBGI that we focus on is that detailed in the urban GI typology of Jones et al. 22, with 3 overarching feature types, predominantly green, predominantly blue, and constructed features, 9 object types, and 49 object categories like park, footpath, green roof, permeable paving, etc. And it's these 49 object categories that we're focusing on in this review. So we have keywords relating to those 49 categories, along with keywords relating to the urban. So we've got urban, cities and towns in there as well. And relating to this specific review, we've got the noise keywords, and that's noise or sound. Additional constraints to the review or requirements are that they must provide quantitative results. It can be modelled or measured in a lab or in the field, but it needs to have a suitable control. So stage 1 was the Web of Science searches. Stage 2, sift by title and abstract. Stage 3 was to scan the full text of any remaining articles, and stage 4 to extract data and references. So the original searches returned 6,913 results. I scanned the title and abstract of those results. That left 209 articles, and around about 10% of those gave us useful data, and there are about 5% of those that are reviews that are yet to be processed to extract the other references and then additional data. So in terms of the data that we have so far, we have useful data for a total of 6 of the GBGI categories, although green wall and green roof are not actually displayed here because we found that they are too complex to sensibly aggregate together as with the others. So we have park, road verge, woodland and hedge, and you can see here the asterisk in the centre is the mean value, and then the hard black line is the median value. You can see that hedge is more effective per metre at attenuating noise than the others. We have a little bit more detail on some of the categories. So for parks, we break it down by dominant vegetation types. We've got mixed vegetation, so that's shrubs and trees, and then we've got just shrubs and just trees, and you can see that the mixed vegetation has a higher mean value than the other two. Similarly for road verge, by dominant vegetation, so again this is mixed on the left, has a higher mean value than just trees on the right. And finally for woodland, and this relates to trees with no understory on the right there, and trees with understory vegetation on the left. And again, the mixed vegetation with the understory appears to be more effective at mitigating noise than just the trees alone. So takeaway messages. Well, there's more to do, particularly on the hybrid GBGI, to try and find a way of sensibly aggregating some data to get values for that. But overall, so far, we would say that diversity of structure and vegetation appears to enhance the effectiveness of noise mitigation when it comes to GBGI, although this has to be heavily caveated, as this could be an artifact of the spatial characteristics of the studies that we've included. I think that's all that we have time for from me, so thanks very much for listening. If you have any questions, please email me at dfletcher@ceh.ac.uk.
Right, good to hear that from David. I think the next person is Diane, also from CEH.
Yeah, exactly. Hi everyone, I'm Diana Bowler, and I'm leading the Biodiversity review. Okay, so biodiversity is a multifaceted concept, can be measured in lots of different ways. For this review, we decided to focus specifically on metrics related to insects for a few reasons. One big reason is there's a lot of concern right now about the status and trends of insect populations and communities. The second reason was more pragmatic. We expected by focusing on insects that we would have a nice discrete pool of studies that we could reasonably review in the time frame that we had. So there have been already a couple of really nice systematic reviews and meta-analyses on the benefits that urban green and blue spaces bring to biodiversity in general. So these are a couple of really recent ones that I would suggest you check out. But these were very broad in terms of the biodiversity they looked at, but narrow in terms of the kinds of infrastructures they were looked at. And already in our review, by just focusing on insects, we found many more studies than these previous reviews so far. So we conducted a systematic review where we looked for studies that met a number of inclusion criteria, and that's what's on this slide now. So we looked for studies that measured insects in terms of richness. Richness is just number of species, or biomass, or number of individuals. They had to measure insects in any kind of green or blue or grey infrastructure according to the topology of Lawrence-Jones that the previous reviews you've heard about are also using, all these different subcategories. And also they had to measure insects in at least 2 types of place within the urban area, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. We went through a sifting process, reading title and abstracts, and after all those steps, we've got just under 200 studies that have passed the full text assessment as being relevant for our review. Okay, so all these studies measure insects in some kind of green or blue space, like above a green roof. A challenge to interpreting the findings of each study is that the number of insects seen is due to many factors that have nothing to do with that green space. So the number of insects you've seen depends on which taxon group the study was focusing on, the time of day, the weather during the sampling, where in the world the study was collecting data. They're much more important for determining the number of insects you see than the green or blue space, which means that in order to assess the effectiveness of that space for insects, we need some kind of reference level or baseline. I think the control group, which you heard about in the previous review. This is where it gets a little bit complicated because the studies all have different kinds of control groups, which means they're all asking slightly different questions about what the benefits are. So for instance, one kind of comparison we see is comparing insects, measuring insects within a green or blue space and outside a green or blue space, so in the grey area. Another comparison we see is they compare insects measured in one type of green space, say above a green roof, with another kind of green space, say above a lawn. The other comparison we see in the studies is that the authors have focused in on a specific kind of green or blue space, so they're focused on parks, but then they compare different types of parks. So maybe they compare more parks with more trees with more kind of recreational parks that have more open space. And the final big pool of studies is simply comparing the number of insects within the urban area with the number of insects in a more rural area or another kind of non-urban land use. And this last group we actually decided to exclude from the review entirely because this last group is really asking about the negative effects of urbanization. Pretty much all the studies find that urban areas on a whole are bad for insects. So I'll go through now the levels of evidence we find in each of these groups. So actually in this first group, which I think is the typical comparison of all the other themes you'll hear today, we found very few in this theme. So very few ecologists go looking for insects in grey areas. It's partly because we don't expect to find them. Grey areas have no resources for insects, so you don't really go down a street with a net. And some of our sampling methods you just couldn't do in an impervious surface. You can't put a pitfall trap in the ground. So we have very few studies in this first group. Where we do have a few is studies measuring insects above a green roof versus above a conventional roof. But that's it, really. We have quite a lot of studies in this second comparison, so comparing insects in urban woodlands versus parks or lawns, so comparing different broad types of green space. But most of the studies are really in this bottom left group, where the authors are really interested in the attributes of a green space that matter for insects. And the kind of attributes they look at are the area, the connectivity, the number of flowers, the tree density, a big one is whether the extent of native versus non-native species, plant species. And an even bigger pool of studies is in this final comparison. So on the whole, ecologists are really implicitly assuming that there is a benefit of green space, and we've been much more concerned with how do we design green spaces to have maximal benefits for insect communities. Thanks a lot, and you can find me later if you have any questions.
Thanks very much, Diana. Thomas.
Thank you. Everyone, I'm Thomas, and I was leading the systematic review into all things water, which included both water flow and water quality initially. I'd like to thank Yanis and Franik for working with me on this. This is a green infrastructure for it has been a long feature of stormwater engineers, and these ideas go way back, and there's some definition here that say this involves infiltration and evaporation, runoff, all sorts of processes that generate runoff. And this makes it quite a complicated problem, because what actually do you mean when you think about water flow? Here's a picture of the hydrological cycle where water evaporates and rains down and infiltrates and run off. And so there are very many ways that infrastructure of any sort can interact with the water flow and impact the water flow. And so we've sort of come up with a range of indicators here that relate back to what we have found in the literature here. This is work in progress, and talk more about that in a second. So, first, we were tasked with having water as a whole, so that was water flow and water quality. We then did the initial searches across the 52 types we've already looked at, and it turned out that if we looked at water flow alone, we got something like 60,000 papers.
which was too much. So we looked at the last 5 years instead, which brought it down to about 16,000 references. If we did the same for water quality, we had more than 100,000 papers that related back to green infrastructure and wetlands, etc., etc. And we haven't really tackled that yet. So we're focusing on water flow at the moment. So we had about, by focusing on the last 5 years, we've managed to whittle it down to almost 16,000 initial abstracts, which we have then gone through and whittled down. Huge efforts, so we've whittled it down to about 700. That by reading the abstracts and the titles, that we're going to have a closer look at. And that will hopefully give us a list of papers that we think are eligible, the final set, from which we're then going to do the extraction here. Now, getting from 16,000 to 700 has been a major effort. It's been a lot of screening, but now we're down to a more manageable, and this has been done by a dedicated team, but now we need to reach out to a broader team of experts just to make sure that we haven't missed anything really crucial. But the timeline here is that end of September we'll have we'll have whittled the 700 down to an even smaller number, and hopefully end of November we will have done the data extraction, which will allow us to do the actual analysis like the ones you have just seen there. So hopefully this is what we're aiming for. We think this has been a major effort, so we're hoping to write this up as a contribution to a new journal, which is called Nature Water, towards the end of the year. So that was a short summary of progress on the water review.
Thank you very much, Thomas. The next review is Neria from Warwick.
Hello. What? Hello, everyone. So my name is Neria Calvillo, and I've been leading the review on mental health and well-being. We had similar challenges as everyone else when trying to identify the search words, and we started with health and well-being, then narrowed down to mental health and well-being, and still is a massive endeavor. But we have an amazing team of researchers, 10 universities, and people ranging from PhDs to full professors. What we figured out at the very early stages of the review is that mental health and well-being are very openly defined, let's say, concepts, and one includes the other in its definition. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a component of health and well-being, and therefore where to cut the papers that are connected to these issues has been a challenge. We went for the ones who included the terms, but then again, they might exclude other things, obviously. And something that is also really important that we're finding that is kind of lacking in many of them is the understanding that there's determinants that go beyond people's encounter with a green or blue infrastructure that are related to more structural and personal issues and context. So we've had a challenge, or let's say some differences with the other reviews in terms of the synchronization. So the first one is that the treatment type varies. So instead of focusing on very specific types of green and blue infrastructures, the description or the studies are more focused on land coverage, for example, or density, as Lizzie was mentioning this morning. Then the intervention classification doesn't match to the list that we had, and therefore it's going to be a challenge to compare it to other reviews. And then something also really important is the treatment size. So there's very little information on the size of the green and blue infrastructure. They're more defined through visual conditions, through exposure, and therefore it's going to be a challenge to identify the benefits per spatial unit, for example. So within our own review, we are also finding challenges that we are kind of dealing with, but mostly what we've decided is to try to bring all the data possible and available and then decide where to go. So almost each paper uses a different descriptor. Then there's positive and negative effects, and whether that is a benefit of green infrastructures, then that's an interesting question. If you don't increase depression, is that a benefit? Then almost each paper uses a different form of measurement and index, as Lizzie was mentioning this morning as well. There are country-related variations of each of the indices. And then the data comes in numbers, gradients, positive, negative. So even within the same search, almost every paper looks different. So at the beginning, we identified 8,200 papers with mental health and well-being and urban and each of the interventions. The initial screening title and abstract led us to 550 or so, and now what we're doing is to choose the full text and doing the data collection at the very same time, because otherwise, basically, it's being more productive. However, what we are seeing is that there's a lot of crossover across categories, across interventions, because obviously papers are not using the same terminology. And therefore, there's a lot of repetition that we need to be aware of, and so forth. But we have a similar plan to the water synthesis review, and we aim to end the data collection, hopefully, by the end of November this year. If you have any questions or want to have a chat about these, please get in touch later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neria. Now I'd like to invite Jill from Sheffield.
So hi, I'm lucky going last, so I don't need to introduce so much about what we're doing in terms of the systematic review, but my focus is looking at carbon in urban systems. And so when we think about carbon in urban systems, we've got the GBGI typology that people have discussed, but the carbon occurs in different places. So we can think about the above ground vegetation supporting carbon storage, really importantly, the below ground storage of carbon. And this is what my background is, but quite new to me is also looking within the blue infrastructure in our cities for carbon storage estimates. And what I'm going to focus on today is carbon storage, so the stocks that are held in urban systems rather than sequestration. There really isn't much data out there. We looked and we included it in our literature searches, but there isn't much data out there on sequestration at all. But for us, the complexity, each of these different systematic reviews come with different complexities. For us, the complexity really is the different forms of carbon that people study and that we talk about in urban systems. Above ground vegetation is pretty simple. It's ecosystem-derived organic carbon. But below ground and in water bodies, it starts to become much more complex. And in our review of the literature, we came across data on organic carbon. So that's stuff that is ecosystem-derived from the above ground vegetation predominantly. Then inorganic carbon, which would come from a geological source. But also in urban systems, you've got the added complexity of anthropogenic sources, so things like concrete. And then black carbon, which links to pollution. So black carbon's there as the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels and biomasses, so that's soot and things like that. And so what we're kind of primarily interested in is the organic carbon, but a lot of papers report total carbon. So we're going to have to be careful when we extract data how we use it. And so we finished extracting data last Thursday, so I've got a bit of provisional data for you to show you in this talk. So we started out, when we searched, did our initial screening, we got down to, by searching by most relevant and most recent papers, we got down to nearly 4,000 from, I think, about 30 or 40,000 papers initially. Post-abstract screening, we got down to about 400 or 500, and then the papers that we've extracted data from are about 250, I think. And we looked at the geographical distribution of that data, and it's really heavily concentrated in Asia, but also in both Europe and North America had a high level of data on carbon storage in urban systems. So there's data really lacking from Africa, Oceania, and South America. And then looking at number of data points, so shrinking down the GBGI types from 40 odd to general, the categories, you can see that the majority of the data that we extracted, so these are a number of data points per type, was from parks and from other unsealed public areas. And that relates to the point that Neria was making a little while ago about the fact that they don't always conform to the GBGI types. The interesting thing was that soil had by far and away the most data. That's probably a good thing. It's where most of the carbon's stored in the urban system. So I'm going to focus very briefly on some data that I've extracted that we got to last week. And that's looking at just the organic carbon concentration in the GBGI types that we have data for. And you can see that, and so the concentration is on the y-axis, and these are the GBGI types that we've got data from. And 90% of that data falls in the green bars. So there's a small amount of data on the constructed green infrastructure, the hybrid green infrastructure, and the water bodies. Water bodies have very high concentrations of carbon, which is quite reassuring, to be honest. That's what you'd expect. But then when we break it down into the individual categories of those 50 or so types, you can see, I've just ranked these in order of size. So city farms got the smallest carbon concentration according to our data, wetlands the highest. And the green are all the green infrastructure, grey is engineered infrastructure. But within that, 55% of the data is in 4 green infrastructure types. So the most data we have is about parks, probably not surprising, is it? But then 10% of them, that's over 25% of our data comes from park studies. Then we've got gardens we know quite a lot about, allotments, and also botanical gardens. So there's a huge amount of data concentrated in 4 GBGI types. And so really, to summarise what we found so far, and it very much is, you know, we only got the data last week and we'll be refining it and it needs cleaning as well. We know that the data, geographically, we don't have an understanding across the globe of these the different roles of GI types in carbon storage across the globe. And there's a lack of data on carbon stocks in Africa, South America, and Oceania. The focus of the research really has been on soils in urban systems, and that's, as I said, it's probably a good thing. We know that carbon is held, most of our carbon is held in terrestrial systems in our soils, so understanding that is really, really important. But we also know that we know a lot about, well, you know, a relatively large amount about some systems and not so much about others. But reassuringly, the preliminary data conforms to the trends you would predict, thinking about what we know about carbon storage in soils. So wetlands have more, green spaces have more than engineered soils. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. The final talk will be from Prashant.
Okay, so at this time, I think I will be talking about the most talked topic about the air pollution and the green-blue infrastructure. So this basically follows the similar, the style what we have been doing of the systematic literature reviews. And you could see quite a few people who are already there, Krina and Abhijit, who are involved, apart from a number of the other colleagues who will be joining at some stage. So the whole idea again has been to understand the mitigation impact of this different type of the green-blue infrastructure when it comes to the air pollution removal potential. Now the challenge here is again the different type of pollutants. So you can have the particulate matters in different size ranges, from the gaseous to the to the black carbon and so on. And one of the ideas has been that what are the among these 51 different GBGA types we have been following are the most studied, and which one are the least studied, and how we could identify the gaps and possibly come up with some recommendations. So again, it just focuses on the air pollution, the removal potential, and it does not talk about the health and the mental health and well-being, as you can already see the reviews which are complementing and creating that area. Now, see, so using this similar sort of analogy, we started here with almost 18,000 publications through the initial search, and then when we started toning down, we have got around 207 papers which meet the criteria of the data extraction which we have set for this review. Interestingly enough, you see that almost 80% of these studies have been focused on 6 different GBGA types. So that basically shows that we got quite a lot around, but not a lot of them are studied so intensively. And especially if you look into the street trees, green walls, hedges, parks, and green roofs, and these are possibly the ones actually which has got the majority of the makeup there. But then there is a lot actually to see in there, but there is quite a lot if you see on the first one, and the gray kind of thing, so that's on a scale which goes from very little to very high. So there are a number of these GBGA types where there is literally nothing there. So this basically a kind of a gap in terms of when you're talking about the different type of this GBGA installation or implementation in the urban environment, then how they can be, how you could build a case actually about the ecosystem services they provide in terms of the air pollution reduction. And obviously there has been quite a lot of rise of studies from the late kind of, the 2010 onwards in this particular area, while, we remember that when we did a previous review, that is one of the highest cited reviews in the area in 2017, there were very little studies actually on the topic. So it has grown quite a lot. So there is quite a lot going on in this particular area. And if you look into the different domains, then you see quite a lot coming from Europe, as you can expect. But the Asia, again, comes up on the top. But the reason being that the China, actually, there's lots of studies coming from China, which is kind of influencing this makeup. And obviously, the areas like the Africa and the South America, you don't see a lot actually coming from that potential. But if you look into the perspective of which type of pollutants are studied the most, so as you can expect, almost the more than half of them is going for the PM, so which is PM10, 2.5, and PM1, and there has been a good chunk actually on ozone and the NO2, but very, very little actually on the ultrafine particles, black carbon, VOCs, and the carbon dioxide or the CO, which is again are the important factors when you consider the urban pollution, the environment there. So this is So this is basically the state of the art currently we have on this review. But the whole idea there is again to start with the synthesizing those gaps and making the recommendations based on what we find in the literature. And some of those areas might be worth following up for the for building the proposals and so on. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prashant. Can I also say right at the beginning that thank you very much to all the presenters. I'm having trouble this morning. I think we'll all agree that it's a fantastic amount of work that everyone's doing. There are a lot of knowledge gaps that are being identified, But I also think from several of the discussions that we've had, it's not been easy. There has been a huge amount of literature that they've gathered in a number of instances. In some instances, there's no literature. But it's also the various characterizations don't necessarily match up as well. So it is quite a lot that they're trying to actually pull together. I think the next steps are to finalise the reviews and, where possible, to publish them, and also to then extract a lot of the data into the GBGI database that we're forming. I think also, as we go forward, please talk to other people as you're out in lunch and so on. And if you have any extra information or other aspects that could be included, please talk to the presenters and so on. Just before I do invite you out into the foyer for lunch, can I also mention that there is the artist workshop, which will be next door, and also the campus tour, which please gather by the registration desk. Can I also mention there are some spare tickets also for the campus tours, and please go to the registration desk if you'd like to go on that. I think that's all that I need to cover at the moment. Please go and enjoy networking and enjoy lunch.